Torneko no Daibouken is probably a name that not too many gamers are familiar with, at least if you live outside Japan. It was a spin-off of the exceedingly popular Japanese RPG series Dragon Quest that was developed by Chunsoft at the time. However, contrary to the nature of the mainline Dragon Quest games, Torneko was conceptualized to be a roguelike game, one of the first of its kind on a home console. For those unfamiliar with the genre, a roguelike game is, in very simple terms, an RPG dungeon crawler where the dungeons are randomly generated. At the time of Torneko no Daibouken's development, roguelike games were gaining popularity in the West, so Chunsoft wanted to adapt the genre for the Japanese audience. And they decided to use the familiar and well-liked chubby merchant character from Dragon Quest IV, Torneko, as the game's main character. The full title of the game is Torneko no Daibouken Fushigi no Dungeon, or when localized, Torneko's Great Adventure Mystery Dungeon. I'm sure in hearing that, a lot of people just thought, Mystery Dungeon, you mean that Mystery Dungeon? And yes, Torneko no Daibouken is the little-known first entry in the quite popular Mystery Dungeon series of roguelike games. Over here in America, we typically associate the name Mystery Dungeon with franchises like Pokemon and Final Fantasy, but the fact of the matter is, Torneko did it first. Torneko no Daibouken released on September 19, 1993 for the Japanese Super Famicom and received generally very positive feedback from fans and critics alike. The game was even ranked as number 78 in the popular Japanese gaming magazine Famitsu's list of the top 100 games of all time according to readers back in 2006. So why have many of us Westerners never heard about this game? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. The original game never released outside of Japan. Two sequels that the game spawned were localized for a Western audience, but sold very poorly and did not garner much positive attention at all at the time. So Torneko, much like its parent series Dragon Quest, wasn't able to find its way into the mainstream overseas. And it's precisely for that reason that I wanted to make a review of this game all these years later. The story of Torneko no Daibouken starts out immediately following the end of Dragon Quest IV, but don't worry, you don't need to have played that game to understand what's going on here, because we get a summary of all the facts you should know before getting into the story. In his early days, Torneko was an apprentice studying at the feet of a master weapons merchant, but always had a dream of opening up his own shop and making it a huge success. Eventually he got married to a lovely woman by the name of Nene, and the two even had a son they called Poporo, which is a great name by the way. However, even after all this time, Torneko could not let go of his dream of becoming a great weapons merchant. He decided that in order to become a great merchant, he should go out on adventures and see the world. Nene and Poporo, being the ever-supportive family, urged Torneko to follow his dreams, so he set out to do just that. As he traveled from town to town doing favors for those he met, eventually Torneko got permission to purchase his very own shop in the town of Endor. He gathered up the funds, called over his family, and finally founded his very own shop. After some time, Torneko's family store grew into a very popular business, even attracting the praise of the king. For all intents and purposes, Torneko had achieved his dream, but when he heard rumor of a mysterious dungeon housing untold treasures in a far-off country, he couldn't help but get the urge to go on yet another adventure. Nene, seeing how troubled her husband was by this, once again told him to be true to himself and follow his dreams. What an amazing wife, am I right? But this time, Torneko wouldn't leave his family behind. He took Nene and Poporo with him to the new country where the family founds a modest little shop near the mysterious dungeon that Torneko so longed to explore. This is where this game starts off. But you're not going to be able to jump right into the mysterious dungeon because as a new merchant and adventurer, you have to greet the king of the area first. The king, worried for Torneko's safety, first instructs him to find his treasure chest that is on the 10th floor of a different and less intimidating dungeon, the slightly mysterious dungeon. If he's able to accomplish this task, the king will allow Torneko to enter the mysterious dungeon. And that's pretty much it for story setup. I haven't played Dragon Quest IV yet, but I still really like the lighthearted and fun nature of Torneko's story as summarized here. I know the game doesn't have as in-depth of a story as, say, mainline Dragon Quest games, but I've never been one to knock a game for not focusing on having a grandiose story. Games like Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong Country are considered to be some of the best of all time, and they don't have very much story either. Like Torneko, they focus on being a fun experience where the story is there mostly to just give purpose to what we're doing. So, what is it that we're actually doing in Torneko? Glad you asked. Like I mentioned before, Torneko is a roguelike RPG dungeon crawler type game, so it would stand to reason that we'll be doing a fair amount of dungeon crawling. And of course that is the bulk of the game, but how exactly does it work? Well, when you first make your way into one of the mysterious dungeons, you'll find yourself at a random location on a randomly generated dungeon floor. And when I say randomly generated, I mean randomly generated. Every time you enter a floor, everything from the rooms and hallways to the location and number of monsters and items is completely randomized. This gives the game an extreme level of replayability in my opinion. In fact, the catchphrase of the game in Japan at the time of release was the RPG you can play 1,000 times. And honestly, with how different every run is, I can honestly see that being the case. Like many other roguelikes and RPGs, in Torneko, you can pick up various weapons, items, and spells to be used to strengthen yourself or damage your enemies. These items, like I just mentioned before, are randomly spread throughout each floor and quite generously at that. You'll probably find somewhere between 5 to 10 items per floor, and that means your bag is going to fill up quite quickly. One of the major tenets of a roguelike game is that it features a strong emphasis on item management, and I think Torneko handles this very well. You're constantly faced with tough choices and the feeling of, if only I had 5 more slots. Should I drop my stun scroll to pick up more healing, or risk moving down to lower floors with less ability to restore my health? Questions like this are constant in Torneko, and personally I really like the amount of thought and planning that was required to make it farther in the dungeon. With each attempt, I found myself getting more and more cunning when it came to inventory management and the timing of the use of my items. It's honestly a really good feeling, and thanks to the random nature of the items and their placement, you're constantly having to come up with new plans in order to progress with what items you are given. Some attempts are going to be harder than others because you just didn't get the items you were hoping for, but that's all part of the fun of a roguelike game. But before we get too far into the mechanics of the game, let's talk about the core of the gameplay here, the combat. In true RPG fashion, Torneko is a turn-based game where, as the name implies, you and your enemies take turns attacking one another. However, unlike mainstream RPGs, Torneko has a bit of a different take on the turn-based style. Battles are not instants and take place directly on the dungeon floor, where you can move around and attack whenever you so choose. But when you do perform an action, all enemies around you can also perform an action. So when you move a space attack or use an item, all enemies then have the chance to do the same. It's a much more fast-paced version of your typical turn-based combat, and I very much enjoyed that speed and sense of freedom. This is of course an RPG, so you're going to be leveling up and getting stronger as you defeat monsters and progress through the dungeon. The levels don't matter too much if you're fighting most of the enemies on each floor, but if you do rush your way down at low level, you will certainly be punished for it hard. Just take your time and clear each floor thoroughly, and you most likely won't run into a point where you find yourself extremely underleveled. Now, I've been talking about this concept of making multiple attempts at the dungeon for a while now, but what does that actually mean? In essence, it's what sets the mystery dungeon games apart from more purist roguelike games. I'm sure there are many people out there who wouldn't even consider Torneko a roguelike because it doesn't feature a permanent death mechanic. In a true roguelike, when you die or fail, that's it. You have to start again from nothing. But in Torneko, when you fail, the story continues. In fact, the story is built under the assumption that you will fail multiple times, because when you run out of health, the gold you found up until that point isn't all lost, it's just cut in half. This remaining gold is then used to upgrade Torneko's shop into a progressively larger business. There's even a special item that allows you to return with all your gold, and one that allows you to bring your entire inventory back to sell or bring with you on future runs. Now, the amount of items you can take with you is very limited, increasing with the upgrades of your shop to a maximum of just 4, but this opens up a whole new form of gameplay. Instead of press your luck and possibly die losing all your items, you can use this scroll to bring what you have back to the surface with you in hopes of doing better on the next run. There are certain scrolls that when used increase the effectiveness of your sword and shield, and these bonuses are carried over as well, meaning you can keep getting stronger and stronger with each attempt as long as you use this scroll to exit with your inventory each time. It's worth noting that one of these scrolls, known as the Redaimito scroll, will always be found on the 20th floor, so there is a feasible way to get progressively stronger with each run if you're confident you can make it that far. This is probably the main reason Torneko is considered slightly different from a typical roguelike game. Also, during the time you spend in town between runs, you can talk to the townspeople about various things, sometimes picking up tips about how to better make your way through the dungeon. There's even a few side stories with the villagers that progress as you grow your store bigger and bigger. My favorite was definitely the one with the merchant from the neighboring town, who, no matter how great your shop becomes, will always tell you his is better and yours is garbage. Not really anything important to the story, but I found these little side chats with the villagers to be a surprisingly fun part of the game. Getting back to the topic of gameplay, I like to just quickly mention the Impasu scroll, which allows you to identify items. Some items like rings and spell staves will always be labeled with an ambiguous name when originally picked up, meaning that you won't be able to tell what spell or effect they have until either you identify them with the Impasu scroll or test them out yourself. Testing them out can be quite scary because there are some rings and spells that have less than ideal effects, like making enemies multiply or causing your food meter to decrease quicker. Rings and weapons can even be cursed, meaning they can't be taken off unless you cleanse them with a special scroll, and that makes putting on a new item always a bit of a scary moment. Sometimes the first item you'll find is a cursed club that does 0 damage, and you won't be able to switch to a better weapon until you get rid of the curse. It's really a rather fun mechanic that keeps even the most mundane tasks of a game, like equipping items, rather interesting. Since I just brought it up, I should probably talk about another of the major mechanics of Torneko, the various gauges that you'll have to manage. The most important of which is obviously your health, but each one plays a very important role in the gameplay of Torneko. The food meter or fullness meter is second only to your health in terms of importance, some may even argue even more important as it degrades very quickly as you walk around and can only be restored through eating bread that at times can be a very scarce resource. Bread honestly became more important to me than pretty much every other item in the game. When you see bread on the ground, pick it up because you're gonna need it. I'd also recommend saving the bread you bring back with you to bolster your future run's food supply. It's really that important. Running out of food is probably the scariest thing that can happen to you in this game in my opinion. The third gauge is much less important as it doesn't directly affect your survival, but it is nonetheless a gauge that you should pay close attention to, and that is the power or strength gauge. This gauge determines how much damage your attacks do, meaning it is definitely pretty important. When you're first starting out with the game, it can be a little forgettable, but as you begin to face stronger and stronger monsters, it becomes an extremely crucial resource to manage. There are certain poisonous monsters and traps that will lower your strength gauge, and this is only remedied through the use of special herbs. The one you should really use in this situation is the antidote herb because it restores your whole strength bar, and the other option, the seed of strength, can be used to increase your maximum strength and thus your maximum damage, but only when you have a full strength bar. Otherwise, it restores only one strength, which is definitely not worth it. Another mechanic of Torneko that you'll have to watch out for are the traps and monster houses. Traps are completely invisible unless revealed with an item, so realistically, anywhere you step could trigger a trap unless you're in a hallway. Traps include things like landmines and holes that can be very detrimental to your progression and definitely play a major role in the game's difficulty. You can just be walking along, minding your own business, picking up items, when out of nowhere you fall into a room filled with monsters. You don't have to have played the game to understand that this is a less than ideal situation, but they keep you on your toes. Traps feel like they were put into the game to give you a sense that you're never safe. Every step, even in a room with no monsters, could prove fatal. On the contrary to that, we have monster houses that are very upfront about how dangerous they are. When you walk into a room that is classified as a monster house, the music will instantly change to a more urgent and fast-paced song, and you'll find yourself surrounded on all sides by monsters. This is admittedly the worst situation that you can find yourself in this game, but there are a number of ways to deal with such situations as there are with anything in Torneko. You could use an EO scroll to damage all the monsters in the room, or you could fall back into a hallway to funnel the enemies at you one at a time, or you could place a sanctuary scroll on the ground that prevents monsters from attacking you, or you could stun all the enemies with a scroll and run away. The list goes on. Even though it's possibly the worst situation to find yourself in, there are so many ways to plan ahead and prevent yourself from dying to a monster house, and that just sums up the game as a whole in my opinion. It may be an exceedingly difficult game, but I never felt like it was unfair, like I had no control over the outcome of each run. Of course, there are factors that will be out of your control, but for the most part, it was a very fair game, and it's really just super fun to play. I think we've talked enough about the gameplay for now, so let's move over to the artistic side of Torneko. The visuals, like many of the other Dragon Quest games, are very vibrant and colorful. You're never really going to get bored looking at the screen, as there's always something new that'll catch your attention, be it an enemy or a new item. The background of the dungeon floors also change as you move through the dungeon, and a lot of them, like the ice background or the lava background, were very pleasing to look at, not to mention the character designs. As someone who doesn't have very much experience with the Dragon Quest franchise, one of the things that always made me want to play the games more was the really cool and fun designs of the characters and monsters. I especially like the design for Torneko. He's not by any means your typical main character, and that is exactly what makes him great in my eyes. I feel like most main characters in RPGs and just video games in general are made to be relatable to the person playing the game. But I find that rather than the characters that are made with the specific purpose of being relatable, I relate more to characters that were made without that in mind, like side characters. That's why I ended up liking characters like Torneko and Firebrand from Demon's Crest more than the main characters of the series they come from. Also, Torneko just has a really great design. I mean, just look at the cover of the game. Who wouldn't love this sweaty old guy? The monster designs are also super memorable and just plain fun. They're all taken directly from the Dragon Quest series, but I guess don't fix what ain't broke. My favorite enemy is probably the big green Cyclops guys because I just think they had a really cool design. Moving on to the music, Torneko had some of the most catchy songs I've heard from a video game in recent memory. I'll probably be using the soundtrack as background music for this video, so you can take a listen and see for yourself. The composition for the game's soundtrack was done by Sugiyama Koichi, who has worked on just about every single Dragon Quest game to date, as well as, more notably, Jesus the Game. The man writes some mean melodies that definitely won't leave your head for a while after you finish playing. The songs in Torneko no Daibouken are, for the most part, arrangements of the original Torneko's theme from Dragon Quest IV, and honestly I have no problem with that. It's a super catchy tune, and the arrangements take the change far enough that you won't really even notice that they're based on the same song. I know I always seem to gush over retro game soundtracks, but can you really blame me? I mean, they're all just so dang good, and Torneko's soundtrack, while somewhat short, is most certainly not an exception. Last but not least, let's cover the actual condition required to clear the game and get the credits. In theory, it's a really simple task. Make your way down to the 27th floor of the dungeon, where you'll find a box called the Chest of Happiness and bring it back to the surface. Well, let me tell you, it is much easier said than done. It took me around 50 attempts to finally complete and get the box back to the surface. Each attempt took an average of somewhere between 30 minutes to an hour and a half, so some simple math will tell you that I spent way too much time this week playing Torneko. It's a super hard game that definitely doesn't pull any punches. You always need to be planning ahead or you'll quickly fall behind, but contrary to some of the other games I played recently, I never found myself getting frustrated with Torneko. Sure, the times when I lost some of my more powerful items I've been working really hard to power up were pretty sad, but I always found myself compelled to just jump back into the dungeon and see how far I could get. Like I've been trying to get across this whole review, Torneko is plain and simple a really fun game, and honestly for the first time in a while, I found myself not wanting to beat the game because I knew that when I beat it, the game would end. Well, luckily for me, there was some extra content after you complete the game, but we'll get into that a little later. When you do finally manage to make your way back to the surface with the Chest of Happiness, Torneko's shop is upgraded to its largest stage, at this point resembling more of a castle than a shop, and Torneko makes his way to the shop to display the Chest of Happiness for all to see. On his way there, Torneko speaks with all the residents of the town closest to him, who congratulate him and thanks to the box's effects, all feel a sense of joy and happiness. Torneko displays his prized treasure on a pedestal in the back of the store, flashes a peace sign, and the game ends. You then have to power cycle the console to get back into the game. When you load up your town next, the villagers have all encountered some sort of miraculous work of happiness. The most amazing of which is that the old man who lives with you had his teeth grow back so he can talk again, all thanks to Torneko and the Chest of Happiness. But nothing of the sort has happened to Torneko. Everyone seems to have found happiness, but Torneko alone remains unchanged. When you talk to the king in the back of your shop, he asks you if you're happy, and if you say no, he remarks that Torneko is the type who enjoys the adventure and should ask the chest what he should do next. This is a subtle hint at how to access the last and most challenging of all the dungeons in Torneko no Daibouken, the even more mysterious dungeon. As the name suggests, almost all the names of the items you pick up are changed to generic names that don't tell you what they do, making everything more mysterious. For someone who isn't used to what all the spells and items do yet, this dungeon will prove almost impossibly difficult. Heck, even people that know the items inside and out will find it super hard. The goal this time is also 3 floors lower than the mysterious dungeon, making things even more difficult. And to pile on even more difficulty, there's another item called the Scroll of Proof on the 50th floor that you can also attempt to get. This was considered so difficult that at the time of the game's release, if you sent Chunsoft the picture proving you escaped with the Scroll of Proof, they would send you a special gift. But as you might have guessed, if there's something at 50, why not 99? And yes, if you make your way all the way down to floor 99, you can find the final scroll, but this can be found in either the mysterious dungeon or the even more mysterious dungeon, so it is not considered as rare as the Scroll of Proof. After floor 99, it's just an infinite loop of the same floor, so you can't actually get any lower, but you can continue going down if you so choose. Besides for the main game, there are a few other cool features that I'd like to talk about really quickly, namely the high score and replay features. High scores are pretty self-explanatory, it's just based on how much gold you get in a single run, but it's still really cool in my opinion that you have a way to make the game last even longer after you do everything else it has to offer. I'm sure it was a blast back in the day to compete with your friends over high scores in Torneko, and even just trying to beat your own personal best seems like a ton of fun. The replay feature came as quite a surprise to me. I really wasn't expecting a Super Famicom game to be able to do such a thing, as this was the time where some games still didn't even include the ability to save your progress. Now it does only let you see the last floor that you were on, but still that's way more than I ever would have thought possible on a Super Famicom. You don't even choose to do it, it just happens automatically. Just a really surprising, really cool, and somewhat weird feature the developers decided to put into Torneko. Have you ever had a game come around at the exact perfect time in your gaming life? It's happened to me a few times before, and it happened again with Torneko no Daibouken. As I've said in a few of my other videos recently, I've really been yearning to play some JRPGs, and I also just got finished playing Hades, excellent game by the way, and it really piqued my interest in the roguelike and roguelike genres. Then along came Torneko, a JRPG roguelike game for possibly my favorite console of all time, the Super Famicom. It was seriously like all the stars aligned when I found this game, and after playing it, I can say it was definitely the game I was hoping it would be, and more. If you're interested in RPGs, roguelikes, JRPGs, or just found what you heard and saw here today interesting, consider giving Torneko a try, it's definitely worth your time. Now, as I said earlier, the game was never localized into English, so unless you happen to speak Japanese like I do, you're probably better off getting a translated ROM of the game, as much as it pains me to say it. You probably could get by playing the original Japanese version and not understanding anything, but it would definitely be significantly harder and take away from the general experience. But I think I've talked enough for one video. As always, thanks so much for taking the time to watch all the way to the end, it really means a lot to me. If you enjoyed what you saw here today, consider giving the video a like, it's always greatly appreciated and really helps me out. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Back out. Torneko's name in the English version of Dragon Quest IV was changed to Taloon. Why?